Welcome back to Coffee with B. In today's episode, we are looking forward to discuss about Sri Lanka's economic landscape, from key risks, reforms, and growth opportunities that will shape Sri Lanka's future growth trajectory. So for this discussion, we have got with us a very special guest, Mr. Dhananath Fernando, the Chief Executive Officer and founding member of Advocata Institute. Hi, Dhananath.
Hi, Vimasha.
So we know that Sri Lanka's economy demonstrated resilience in 2024, achieving a 5% growth rate, surpassing earlier projections. However, despite the positive momentum, vulnerabilities persist. For instance, if you take the central government debt to GDP ratio, it stood at 96.7% in March 2025, up from 96.1% in December 2024, indicating a significant financial burden. And also, if you look at the gross official reserves, though they have improved from the crisis lows, they still remain at relatively fragile levels. So, given these factors, what do you identify as the most pressing risks that could undermine the current economic stability in the near term?
It could be any external shock because since our economy is still at a vulnerable stage, it could be a climate shock, it could be a geopolitical event, it could be any event that basically can derail, unfortunately, what we have achieved so far. And when you are coming out from a crisis, I feel that's the nature of it. Because anyway, our economy has been vulnerable for a long time, and the tipping point was 2022. But of course, the shocks that came before, the COVID shock, and before that, the Easter attack, and from 2015, the droughts that had, and everything combined together. So I mean, any risk, geopolitically or locally, will have a big impact for sure. So far, we have been very lucky. Touch wood, I hope that the momentum will continue. And also, for an example, a factor like weather, because the rain gods have been very kind to us, because that helps the agricultural productivity on one side. At the same time, it contributes a lot on our renewable energy generation. So all those factors have contributed in the same way that it has contributed. In case if something goes a little off, things can also go wrong. So as of risk, anything is a risk. It could be external, it could be internal, but so far we are staying on the course, and we are still, even the budget has committed that we'll stay with the IMF program. Again, it doesn't mean that the IMF is the solution for all problems, but that's pretty much only game in town, because if we move out of it, then the repercussions would be quite severe. So far, I mean, we have done well, but the risks are still there, and we are still not out of the woods.
Right. So, and also Sri Lanka has made progress from default to recovery, completing a $12.55 billion debt restructuring in December 2024, and also has got its CCC plus rating affirmed by Fitch this October 2025. So, but yet challenges remain, particularly in terms of the projected debt to GDP ratios and interest to revenue ratios and so on. So, given these fiscal pressures, how crucial do you think that Sri Lanka has to try and regain the trust of the international rating agencies and foreign investors, and also what specific reforms or indicators should the policymakers prioritize to demonstrate genuine credibility and ensure sustained economic stability?
Undoubtedly, the credit rating has to improve, even according to our midterm, long-term plan. What our plan is to basically roll over the debt. That's pretty much most of the governments do when they face, even if they face a crisis or if they don't face a crisis, what they do is basically they roll over the sovereign debt. So of course at CCC or CCC plus levels, we can go to the markets. As we all know, it would be very expensive to borrow money. So definitely the rating has to go up. So to ratings to go up, basically our balance sheet and the signaling to the investors has to be quite positive and optimistic. The main reform that I would see is there are multiple reforms that has to happen, because we also need to understand how this game works. Is one variable is always connected to another variable. And the nature of reforms is, if you don't do all those reforms at the same time, likely that a single reform may backfire. For an example, if we really want to do if we want to attract investments, there are multiple other variables connected to investments or as the bottlenecks. For an example, for investors, land is a key issue. So, you have to think of land issues. At the same time, labor is another issue. So, you have to do the labor reforms. And at the same time, there are customs issues, the custom reforms, the free trade agreements, everything is connected to the investment issue. So, only if we are considering, okay, trade is an issue, and if you are only trying to do, let's say, custom reforms and trade reforms, by just doing that, if we expect that the investors will come, that won't happen. And at that point, people might ask the question, okay, now you have asked to do these reforms, but we really do not see the results. So, then it can backfire. So, out of reforms, I think if we were to prioritize, one would be definitely the trade reforms, because it has a big impact across the board, especially on cost of construction, because it affects everybody. And it is easy to get the public support, and the reason for higher cost of construction is mainly the para tariffs, that is the cess and pal. So, those has been, even in this budget, the President and the Finance Minister promised that it will be phased out, but we really do not know what would be the outcome. It was a promise coming from consecutive governments. So, hope that will happen, because it will have also an impact on the tourism industry, because for tourism industry, the hotels has to be refurbished every 5 years, and cost of construction is connected with the room rates. So, and everything else.
Yes, it's all linked.
It's all linked.
Yes.
So, definitely the cost of construction, trade reforms, para tariffs has to be there, and definitely we can consider some trade agreements. The second one, I would prioritize state-owned enterprises reforms for few reasons. One is that because government has about 4 main issues. Our income is low. Of course, we have done excellently, absolutely well in terms of 2025 numbers, but still generating income is a problem, of course, with slowing down vehicle imports. Second, our expenditure is quite high. Third is we have a debt burden. Fourth is we have an investment problem. So, in my view, this state-owned enterprises reform can bring some level of relief for all these 4 issues, because most of these state-owned enterprises are loss-making. So, if you allow the private sector to involve, if they make a profit, of course, they have to pay 36% taxes for the government. So, rather than making a loss, you can have the government can get some revenue with the profits that they make. Second, your expenditure will be cut down, because as we know, most of these state-owned enterprises are there for no reason. So, your expenditure can be curtailed, and of course, most of the state-owned enterprises have a massive debt burden. It is so high, even the private credit has been impacted. So, that can be another solution. Fourth, for reforming these state-owned enterprises, you can attract investors. If you consider a privatization or any form that will fit based on the state-owned enterprise. So, I would prioritize those 2 at the moment. Of course, there is a lot to be done, but at least those 2 reforms can bring a lot of fiscal space. At the same time, it will give the correct signaling to the investor world, and we can attract the investments, but all this requires also a little bit of time, but better that we get our act together and move fast.
Yeah, so speaking of state-owned enterprises, so the government has now taken decisive steps to address the financial strain from these SOEs. So including, we saw the closure of 33 non-functional SOEs, and also the restructuring of major enterprises like the Ceylon Electricity Board. So given the persistent financial losses and these reform measures, how significant do you believe that these reform measures can reduce the fiscal burden, and also what key obstacles do you see that might prevent these reforms from achieving their intended results?
Generally, any reform is not perceived positively, because change management is difficult. Yes. But in this case, as I mentioned, even if you look at Sri Lankan Airlines, most of their debt is with the 3 state banks.
Yes.
So that has a big burden on the state banks as well as on the CEB, as well as to an extent with the CPC, because what happens is when the Ceylon Electricity Board makes losses, they borrow money pretty much from the Ceylon Petroleum Corporation, or they get fuel on credit basis. And then when they make losses, they charge a premium from Sri Lankan Airlines on their jet fuel. And then as a result, all these three institutions are making losses, because Sri Lankan Airlines makes losses because they buy fuel at a very high rate than the market rate. And as a result, because of the CEB makes losses, since they are getting it on credit, and then since they are not paying what is due, they are also making a loss. Anyway, CEB is making a loss because of the inefficiency. So they have taken some measures, but this basically one institution's issue can become other institutions' problems. So the challenge is when you try to do one institutional reform, that will have a ripple impact on the other institutions. So definitely it's the nature of the game, the political economy works, that everyone collectively will try to block the reform, and that's what exactly pretty much happening over a period of time. So however, CEB reforms have somewhat moved forward. We have some reservations on some of the recent amendments that has been done, but I would say that it is better to have at least the unbundling rather than having it in the previous form. But the challenges are the political economy, definitely number one. Number two is also the government has already passed their first year. When you move to the second year, third year, the appetite for the reforms are basically diluting. So those two challenges at the political front are there, and also the capacity. Even during the previous government, there was an attempt to reform state-owned enterprises. In fact, my chairman Murtaza was part of that state-owned enterprises restructuring committee, but finding bidders, the support from the state-owned enterprises were absolutely minimal. They really do not want to do it, so they were not giving the financial statements, due diligence, they were not cooperative, and they basically blocked it till the last minute before the election. And when the election cycle hits, it's very difficult to do any sort of reform. I think what's positive is there has been a conversation about that state-owned enterprises holding company limited to set up, even it was pronounced in the budget. So hopefully it will go through, but I think like the stock market and the equity markets can be benefited if we do the reforms and probably list it in the Colombo Stock Exchange. But listing it only on the Colombo Stock Exchange may not bring results. It can be one solution, but it should come with a broader reform package. But the trick and the challenge is this: if you listen to the budget very carefully, there was a section that the finance minister says that some of these state-owned enterprises, they haven't done their mandatory payments like the EPF, ETF, the gratuity. So now the numbers are not known. Now they are going to settle some of those mandatory payments on taxpayer money. We don't know the details, because as we all know, state-owned enterprises, they don't necessarily, their financial transparency is very poor. There's 52 strategic state-owned enterprises, but there's a lot which are non-strategic, and we really do not know the details, how much and to what extent. So that means that burden will come on the taxpayer. At the same time, he has mentioned most of these state-owned enterprises have heavy debt burden, and the government is considering to settle some of those debt, because that's anyway those debt are with the main state banks. So again, that means it has to be borne by the taxpayer. But the numbers are not yet revealed. So we have to be cautious, and those challenges may come in on reform, because the moment that you absorb the debt, the management can come and say, look, now we don't have debt, why do you want to restructure it? We can show it to you, run it and show it to you. So those are the challenges. I'm sorry, my answers are generally long given the nature of the complexity.
It's very insightful there.
But those are the main challenges that I see.
Yes. And also, if I were to ask you, so while the macro indicators show stability, some kind of stability, what you call the normal, like many households still feel the pressure in their daily life. So how can the policymakers ensure that the economic growth kind of translates into tangible improvements for ordinary citizens?
Generally, what I say is, for ordinary citizens, their number one enemy is inflation, and their number one friend is growth. What is seen is basically, as you very correctly said, while everyone celebrates stability, people don't feel anything, I mean, any relief on their day-to-day living standards. The simple reason is, what happened was after the crisis, the prices went up. I think a lot of people even have forgotten that we had like 70% inflation, and the pretty much, 1 kilogram of rice was 100 rupees. Now it's at about 220 rupees. Even before the crisis, rice prices going to 100 rupees was a problem, and now it's 200 rupees, almost doubled, or not almost, I mean more than doubled, but no one really, I mean, shout about it, because prices have gone up. So what happens is, when the prices goes up, your wages catches up very, very slowly, and now it's still, I mean, it has gone about 2 to 3 years, but your wages really haven't caught up. At the same time, the inflation is also a form of tax. So as a result, additionally to that inflation tax, you also increase the taxes, so as the interest rates, which basically giving the burden on the taxpayer. So they are basically just recovering from that, but still their wages or the profits really haven't caught up. Of course, the profits have gone up, but if you look at the real value, because after 70% inflation, you can see like big profits, but the value of that money is not as it was before. So that's why people really feel the pain on one side. At the same time, with high 70% inflation, the wealthiest people, they of course had their assets on pretty much on fixed assets, which also appreciated in value. If you look at the land market, the condominium market, that basically appreciated, and that so basically, while those who had money became better, which I have no opposition to that, but of course at the same time, the poorest of the poor, where they spend most of their income on food and on like day-to-day survival, really got impacted. So that's why people really do not feel it, and that's where we have to be very cautious, because if we don't do the growth reforms, people will not see their friend, and when they don't see their friend, they will oppose the reforms, and it can become a vicious cycle, because then they will say, what happened, there was a crisis, and still, because even if you look at our GDP numbers, it's still at the 2018-19 level. So that means it's like, imagine from 2019 to 2025, 6 years, pretty much your income levels haven't improved. It's like working at the same company without a salary increment for 6 years. Definitely you are going to be, I mean, making a decision after one point. So it's the same context when you look at people's mindset. So that's why we have to be cautious. That's why I am worried that the growth reforms are slow, and the only way that we can rescue ourselves are from having growth reforms. And that's where, on your first question, the risks are with the growth reforms basically getting slowed down, and that we have to basically accelerate.
So, as you mentioned about market interest rates, may I ask you, what are your expectations for the future market interest rates? It could be medium term.
So, I do not want to predict anything, but generally the framework that I follow is, when you bring the basically interest rates, as I'm sure this audience definitely know what interest rates are, but the simplest version is, it's the price of the money. When you bring the price of the money, your consumption picks up. But there are two other factors that we need to consider, because when your consumption picks up, that means your imports are also picking up. Whether do you have adequate forex inflows to match that forex demand is the first question. If you don't have that, basically the exchange rate is going to depreciate, or else you have to dilute reserves. So central bank, since their target is mainly the inflation with after the new Central Bank Act, and at the same time when the currency depreciate, it may also have an impact to an extent on the inflation. So as the electricity prices, when the electricity prices goes up, it will have an impact on the water prices. So there's a knock-on impact. So they may doing that. So I do not expect interest rates to drastically go up or go down. Probably they will try to remain as it is. Even in my view, in my personal view, I thought the previous interest rate cut could have also been thought twice. Doesn't mean that the higher interest rates are good,
yes.
But if you try to bring the interest rates artificially down, it may generate a forex challenge, and then we are going back to the same vicious cycle.
Yes.
But what we should avoid is that artificially trying to stimulate the economy by trying to keep the interest rate artificially low, but the growth has to be supported by productivity, not through the interest, trying to stimulate through the interest rates. That's where my context or my basic framework comes in. It has to be driven through the reforms on the factor markets. So I do not see, even as we record, I think the central bank interest rates, they have decided to keep the interest rates as it is. Yes. So very unlikely it will drastically come down, but as we can see, they will try to manage the exchange rate by different tools that they have. For an example, on vehicle imports, on loan to value ratio, they are trying to basically change it to manage that. But if you bring the interest rates artificially down, regardless of your loan to value ratio on vehicles, those imports will come anyway, because when the interest rates is the price of money, people will start spending. I mean, if they can't spend on a vehicle, they will spend on something else, which will have a connected to imports. So that's where the growth has to come from, exports and tradable side. So that's where we will have our forex inflow, and you can manage the exchange rate.
Right, Dhananath. And also, given Sri Lanka's evolving economic landscape, which sectors such as agriculture or manufacturing, renewable energy, tourism, or even IT would present the most promising opportunities for investment?
So with the results, with the data that has been released, for the GDP growth, it's mainly the taxes minus subsidies that has been contributed, because on vehicle taxes, while the vehicle hasn't been manufactured in Sri Lanka, with vehicle taxes, there are other industries that basically supports growth. For an example, insurance industry, the finance industry, and then the spending of the taxes is what has contributed. But overall, it is mainly the services sector, IT, but we have to look at on a broader point of view, because why we discuss all this at a dramatically changing population dynamics are there, because we are having an aging population. That means our labor force is slowly getting basically shrinking. At the same time, our dependency ratio is going up. So that means sectors like healthcare will have a lot of opportunities, because that means you are having an aging population. People are looking at elderly care, healthcare. So those sectors may have an opportunity, and there will be another supporting other lot of industries that is basically coming into play, including the retirement funds and their sustenance and all that. So that's an area which is growing on one side with healthcare. But at the same time, that will also require other bunch of ecosystem. For an example, it could be on transportation services, because how are we going to do it, and also the elderly, when you look at elderly care in terms of their housing, all that will come into play, because people cannot commute. All those actors will have a role on deciding which sectors. But in my view, it is more trending towards more on the services front. At the same time, more on the healthcare front. Renewable energy, definitely yes, with an energy sector is definitely growing, but it will also depend on what other reforms or decision making by the government. For an example, if we connect the grid with India, there is a conversation, not sure it has that this conversation is coming for decades, but if it continues, definitely that is an area. Already we see some uptick, but with the growth that is happening in the southern parts of India, if we can link to that growth, definitely the renewable energy and even manufacturing will have an impact, or will have growth prospects. But it all depends on the policy reforms. But definitely one recommendation could be connecting with the Indian states, because as it was as it was said, your next exports probably is, or your next growth sectors, even you may not be able to imagine at the growth rate that is happening in India, because 10%, 11% growth is quite, we are trying to reach to 5%. They are growing at 11% continuously. So the dynamics are changing rapidly. So I think that is what we have to keep in mind when we consider the growth sectors.
Right, Dhananath. So as for my final question for you, what do you believe, like in your view, what is the most important economic factor that will have the greatest impact in shaping Sri Lanka's future growth trajectory? And why do you believe that it deserves the highest level of focus and policy attention at this stage?
Yeah, single word, inflation, because that's the number one enemy of the poorest of the poor, and that gives a lot of indicators. And even it's only not me, like when Singaporean Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew, he was mainly monitoring about 5 indicators as a dashboard. One was inflation, one was the exchange rate, one was cost of construction, the other one was, if I remember right, the reserves. And his advisor Gay Kwang Sui, who was the architect of the Singaporean financial system, because they knew exactly poor monetary policy can impact all of us, because inflation can basically dilute your hard-earned wealth. So I give a lot of priority for inflation, mainly looking at on the poor person's point of view, perspective, because of course when you cross above a certain threshold, of course your assets appreciate in value with higher inflation. But for poorest of the poor, that is no longer a choice. Of course, even for wealthiest of the wealthier, will still have an impact, but still they can absorb that shock compared to the poorest of the poor. So I will, if you ask one, definitely inflation, but of course, if I have the liberty on second, third, there are a lot more other factors at the same time.
All right. Thank you, Dhananath, very much for taking your time to join us today. It is a very meaningful conversation, and also we truly appreciate your contribution to our segment.
Thank you very much.
That brings us to the end of today's episode. I will be back with another insightful personality in my next segment. Until then, take care. Mountains or beaches? Which do you prefer for a holiday?
Definitely mountains.
Do you prefer reading physical books, e-books, or listening to audiobooks?
Listening to audiobooks.
If you could have dinner with any historical figure, who would it be and why?
With King Dutugamunu.
And why, if you wouldn't mind sharing?
To get the insight on what has happened during his period and the glory that was claimed, and how to understand the real optics of how he achieved the historic gravitas that he had.
Morning person or night owl?
Morning person.
What's the most adventurous thing you've ever done besides Everest Base Camp?
I did a trekking called the Chadar Track, which was ranked as on the wildest track on the planet by the BBC, which was a frozen river that can only be crossed during the winter season from December to February, and the temperature drops to about minus 30 in the evening.
Are you more of a planner or do you go with the flow?
I go with the flow.
And for the last question, one word to describe yourself in a 5-round answer.
A human.